Hello, my dear students. Welcome to Teacher at Home. Today, class, we are going to learn the second chapter, Socialism in Europe and the Russian Revolution. Age of Social Change. In the previous chapter, you read about the powerful ideas of freedom, equality that circulated in Europe after the French Revolution. French Revolution opened up the possibility of creating a dramatic change in the way in which society was structured. As you have read, before the 18th century, society was broadly divided into states and orders, and it was the aristocracy and church which controlled economic and social power. Suddenly, after the revolution, it seemed possible to change this. In many parts of the world, including Europe and Asia, new ideas about individual rights and who controls social power began to be discussed. In India, Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Derosio talked to the insignificance of the French Revolution, and many others debated the ideas of post revolutionary Europe. Development is in the colonies in turn reshaped these ideas of societal change. Not everyone in Europe, however, wanted a complete transformation of society. Responses varied from those who accepted that some change was necessary but wished for a gradual shift to those who wanted to restructure society radically. Some were conservatives, others were rebels or radials. What did these teams really mean in the context of the time? What separated these strands of politics and what linked them together? We must remember that these terms do not mean the same thing in all contexts or all at all times. We'll look briefly at some of the important political traditions of 19th century and see how they influenced change. Then we'll focus on one historical event in which there was an attempt at the radical transformation of society. Through the revolution in Russia, socialism became one of the most significant and powerful ideas of shape society in the 20th century. Liberals, radicals, and conservatives. One of the groups which looked to change society were the liberals. Liberals wanted a nation which tolerated all religions. We should remember that at this time European states usually discriminated in favor of one religion or another. Liberals also opposed the uncontrolled power of dynastic rulers. They wanted to safeguard the rights of individuals against government. They argued a representative elected parliamentary government subject to laws interpreted by a well trained judiciary that was independent of rulers and officials. However, they were not Democrats. They did not believe in universal direct franchise, that is, the right of every citizen to vote. They felt men of property mainly should have the vote. They also did not want the vote for women. In contrast, radicals wanted a nation in which government was based on the majority of a country's population. Many supported women's suffragette movements. Unlike liberals, they opposed the privileges of great landowners and wealthy factory owners. They were not against the existence of private property but disliked concentration of property in the hands of a few. Conservatives were opposed to radicals and liberals. After the French Revolution, however, even conservatives have opened their minds to the need for change. Earlier, in the 18th century, conservatives had been generally opposed to the idea of change. By the 19th century, they accepted that some change was inevitable but believed that the past had the respected and change had to be brought through through a slow process. Such differing ideas about societal change clashed during the social and political turmoil that followed the French Revolution. The various attempts at revolution and national transformation in the 19th century helped define both the limits and potential of these political tendencies. Industrial society and social change. These political trends were signs of a new time. It was a time of profound social and economic changes. It was a time when new cities came up and new industrialized regions developed, railways expanded, and the Industrial Revolution occurred. Industrialization brought men, women, and children to factories. Work hours were often long and wages were poor. Unemployment was common, particularly during times of low demand for industrial goods. Housing and sanitation were problems since towns were growing rapidly. Liberals and radicals searched for solutions to these issues. Almost all industries were the property of individuals. Liberals and radicals themselves were often property owners and employers. Having made their wealth through trade or industrial ventures, they felt that such efforts should be encouraged, that its benefits would be achieved if the workforce in the economy was healthy and citizens were educated. Opposed to the privileges the old aristocracy had by birth, they firmly believed in the value of individual effort, labor, and enterprise. If freedom of individuals was ensured, if the poor could labor and those with capital could cooperate without restraint, they believed the societies would develop. Many working men and women who wanted changes in the world, rallied around liberal and radical groups and parties in the early 19th century. Some nationalists, liberals, and radicals wanted revolutions to put an end to the kind of government established in Europe in 1815. In France, Italy, Germany, Russia, they became revolutionaries and worked to overthrow existing monarchs. Nationalists talked of revolutions that would create nations where all citizens would have equal rights after 1815. Giuseppe Mazzini, an Italian nationalist, conspired with others to achieve this in Italy. Nationalists elsewhere, including India, read his writings. The coming of socialism to Europe, perhaps one of the most far reaching visions of how society should be structured by socialism. By the mid 19th century in Europe, socialism was a well known body of ideas attracted widespread attention. Socialists were against private property and saw it as the root of all social ills of their time. Why individuals owned the property that gave employment, but the property were concerned only with personal gain and not with the welfare of those who had made the property productive. So, if society as a whole, rather than single individuals, control property, more attention would be paid to collective social interest. Socialists wanted this change and they campaigned for it. How could a society without property operate? What would be the basis of socialist society? Socialists had different visions of the future. Some believed in the idea of cooperative. Robert Owen, a leading English manufacturer, sought to build a cooperative community called New Harmony in India, USA. Other socialists felt that cooperatives could not be built on a wide scale only through individual initiative. They demanded that government encourage cooperatives. In France, for instance, Louis Blanc wanted the government to encourage cooperatives and replace capitalist enterprises. The cooperatives were to be associations of people who produced goods together and divided the profits according to the work done by members. Karl Marx 1818 and 1883 and Friedrich Engels 1820-1895 added other ideas to the body of arguments. Marx argued that industrial society was capitalist. Capitalists owned the capital, investment in factories, and the profit of capitalists were produced by workers. The condition of workers could not improve as long as the profit was accumulated by private capitalists. Workers had to overthrow capitalism and the rule of private property. Marx believed that to free themselves from capitalist exploitation, workers had to construct a radically socialist society where a property was socially controlled. This would be a communist society. He was convinced that workers would term in the conflict with capitalists. A communist society was the natural community of the future. Support for socialism. By the 1870s, socialist ideas spread through Europe. To cooperate their efforts, socialists formed an international body, namely the Second International. Workers in England and Germany began forming associations to fight for better living and working conditions. They set a fund to help members in times of distress and demanded a reduction of working hours and right to vote. In Germany, the associations worked closely with the Social Democratic Party (SPD) and helped it win parliamentary seats. By 1905, socialists and trade unions formed a Labour Party in Britain and the Socialist Party in France. However, till 1914, socialists were succeeded in forming a government in Europe. Represented by strong figures in parliamentary politics, the ideas did shape legislation, but governments continued to be run by conservatives, liberals, and radicals. The Russian Revolution. In one of the least industrialized of European states, the situation was reversed. Socialists took over the government in Russia through the October Revolution 1917. The fall of monarchy in February 1917 and the events of October are normally called the Russian Revolution. How did this come about? What were the social and political conditions of Russia when the revolution occurred? To answer this question, let us look at Russia a few years before the revolution. Russian Empire 1914. In 1914, Tsar Nicholas II ruled Russia and its empire. Besides the territory around Moscow, the Russian Empire included current day Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, parts of Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. It stretched to the Pacific and comprised today's Central Asian states, as well as Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. The majority regions was Russian Orthodox Christianity, which had grown out of the Greek Orthodox Church, but the empire also included Catholics, Protestant, Muslims, and Buddhists. Economy and society. At the beginning of the 20th century, the vast majority of Russia's people were agriculturists. About 85% of the Russian Empire's population earned their living from agriculture. This proportion was higher than in most European countries. For instance, in France and Germany, the proportion was between 40% 50%. In the Empire, cultivators produced for the market as well as for their own needs, and Russia was a major exporter of grain. Industry was found in pockets. Prominent industrial areas were St. Petersburg and Moscow. Craftsmen undertook much of the production, but large factories existed alongside craft workshops. Many factories were set up in 1890s. Russia's railways network was extended, and foreign investment in industry increased. Coal production doubled, and iron and steel output quadrupled. In the 90s, in some areas, factory workers and craftsmen were almost equal in number. Most industry was the private property of industrialists. Government supervised large factories to ensure minimum wages and limited hours of work. But factory inspectors could not prevent rules being broken. In craft units and small workshops, the working day was sometimes 15 hours. Compared with 10 to 12 hours in factories, accommodation varied from rooms to dormitories. Workers were in a divided social group. Some had strong links with the villages from which they came. Others had settled in cities permanently. Workers were divided by skill. A metal worker of St. Petersburg recalled metal workers considered themselves aristocrat among other workers. Occupation demanded more training and skill. Women made up of 31% of the factory labor force by 1914, but they were paid less than men. Divisions among workers showed themselves in dress and manners too. Some workers formed associations to help members in times of unemployment or financial hardship, but such associations were few. Despite divisions, workers did unite to strike work. When they disagreed with employers about dismissals or work conditions, these strikes took place frequently in the textile industry during 1896-1897, metal industry during 1902. In the countryside, peasants cultivated much of the land, but the nobility, the crown, and the Orthodox Church owned large properties. Like workers, peasants too were divided. They were also deeply religious, but except in few cases, they had no respect for the nobility. Nobles got their power and position through their services to the Tsar, not through local popularity. This was unlike French, where during the French Revolution in Britannia, peasants respected nobles and fought for them. In Russia, peasants wanted the land of nobles to be given to them. Frequently, they refused to pay rent and even murdered landlords. In 1902, this occurred on a large scale in South Russia. In 1905, such incidents took place all over Russia. Russian peasants were different from other European peasants in another way. They pooled their land together periodically and their commune divided according to the needs of the individual families. Socialism in Russia. All political parties were illegal in Russia before 1914. The Russian Socialist Social Democratic Workers' Party was formed in 1898 by socialists who respected mass ideas. However, because of government's policy, it had to cooperate as a illegal organization. It set up a newspaper, mobilized workers, and organized strikes. Some Russian socialists felt that the Russian peasant custom of dividing land periodically made them natural socialists. So, peasants, not workers, would be the main force of the revolution, and the Russia could become socialist more quickly than other countries. Socialists were active in the countryside through the late 19th century. They formed a Socialist Revolutionary Party in 19. This party struggled for peasants' rights and demanded that land belonging to nobles be transformed to peasants. Social democrats disagreed with socialist revolutionaries about peasants. Lenin felt that peasants were not one united group. Some were poor and others rich. Some worked as laborers while others were capitalists who employed workers. Given the differentiations within them, they could not be all part of a socialist movement. The party was divided over this tragedy of organization. Vladimir Lenin, who led the Bolshevik group, thought that in a repressive society like Tsarist Russia, the party should be disciplined and should control the number and quality of the members. Others, Menshevik, thought that the party should be open to all, as in Germany. A turbulent time in 1905 revolution. Russia was an autocracy. Unlike other European rulers, even at the beginning of the 20th century, the Tsar was not subject to parliament. Liberals in Russia combined to end this state of affairs up together with the social democrats and social revolutionaries that worked with the peasants and workers during the revolution of 1905 to demand a constitution. They were supported in the empire by nationalists and a Muslim dominated area by jihadists who wanted modernized Islam to lead their societies. The year 1904 was a particularly bad one for Russian workers. Prices of essential goods rose so quickly that real wages declined by 20%. Membership of workers' associations rose dramatically. When four members of the Assembly of Russian Workers, which had been formed in 1904, were dismissed at the Putilov Iron Works that were a call for industrial action. Over the next few days, over 110,000 workers in St. Petersburg went on strike demanding a reduction in the working day to 8 hours, an increase in wages and employment, improvement in working conditions. When the processions of workers led by Father Gapan reached the Winter Palace, it was attacked by the police and Cossacks. Over 100 workers were killed and about 300 wounded. The incident, known as Bloody Sunday, started a series of events that became known as 1905 Revolution. Strikes took place all over the country. University closed down when student bodies stacked wall outs, complaining about the lack of civil liberties. Lawyers, doctors, engineers, and middle class workers established the Union of Unions and demanded a constituent assembly. During the 1905 revolution, the Tsar allowed the creation of an elected consultative parliament of Duma. For a brief while during the revolution, there existed a large number of trade unions, factory committees made up of factory workers. After 1905, most committees and unions worked unofficially since they were declared illegal. Severe restrictions were placed on political activity. The Tsar dismissed the first Duma within 75 days and re-elected second Duma within 3 months. He did not want any questioning of his authority or any reduction in his power. He changed the voting laws and packed the third Duma with the conservative politicians. Liberals and revolutionaries were kept out. The First World War and Russian Empire. 1914 war broke out between the two European allies, Germany, Austria, Turkey, and France, Britain, and Russia. Each country had a global empire and the war was fought outside Europe as well as in Europe. This was the First World War. In Russia, the war was initially popular and people rallied around Tsar Nicholas II. As the war continued through the Tsar refused to consult the main parties in the Duma, support wore them, anti-German sentiments ran high, as can be seen in the renaming of St. Petersburg, a German name, as Petrograd. The Tsar in Alexander's German origins and poor advisors, especially a monk called Rasputin, made the autocracy unpopular. The First World War on the Eastern Front differed from that of the Western Front. In the West, armies fought from trenches stretched along Eastern France. In the East, armies moved a good deal and fought battles, leaving large casualties. Defeats were shocking and demoralizing. Russia's armies lost badly in Germany and Austria between 1914 and 1916. There were over 7 million casualties in 1917 as they treated the Russia army destroyed crops and buildings to prevent the enemy from being able to live off the land. The destruction of crops and buildings led to over 3 million refugees in Russia. The situation discredited the government and the Tsar. Soldiers did not wish to fight such a war. The war also had a severe impact on industry. Russia's own industries were few in number. Country was cut off from other suppliers of industrial goods by German controlled of the Baltic Sea. Industrial equipment disintegrated more rapidly in Russia than elsewhere in Europe. 1916, railway lines began to break down. Able-bodied men were called up by the war. As a result, there were labor shortages and small workshops producing essentials were shut down. Large supplies of grain were sent to feed the army. For the people in the cities, bread and flour became scarce. By the winter 1916, riots at bread shops were common. February Revolution in Petrograd. In the winter 1917, conditions in the capital Petrograd were grim. The layout of the city seemed to emphasize the divisions among its people. The workers' quarters and factories were located on the right bank of the river Neva. On the left bank were the fashionable areas, the Winter Palace, and official buildings, including the palace where the Duma met. In the February 1917, food shortages were deeply felt in the workers' quarters. Winter was very cold and there had been exceptional frost and very heavy snow. Parliamentarians wishing to preserve elected government were opposed to the Tsar's desire to dissolve the Duma. On 22nd February, a lookout took place at a factory on the right bank. The next day, workers in 50 factories called a strike in sympathy. In many factories, women led the way to strikes. They came to be called the International Women's Day. Demonstrating workers crossed from the factory quarters to the center of the capital, the Nevsky Prospect. At this stage, no political party was actively organizing the movement. The fashionable quarters and official buildings were surrounded by workers. The government imposed a curfew. Demonstrators dispersed by the evening, but they came back on the 24th and 25th. Government called the cavalry and police to keep an eye on them. On Sunday, 25th February, the government suspended the Duma. Politicians spoke out against the measure. Demonstrators returned in force to the streets on the left bank on the 26th. On the 27th, police headquarters were ransacked. The streets are thronged with people raising slogans about bread wages, better hours, and democracy. The government tried to control the situations and called out chivalry once again. However, the chivalry refused to fire on the demonstrators. An officer was shot at the barracks of a regiment, and other three regiments multinied voting to join the striking workers. But that evening, soldiers and striking workers had gathered in the form of a Soviet and council in the same building in the Duma met. This was the Petrograd Soviet. The next day, the delegation went to see the Tsar. Military commanders advised him to abdicate. He followed their advice and abdicated on 2nd March. Soviet leaders and Duma leaders formed a professional government to run the country. Russia's future would be decided by the Constituent Assembly, elected on the basis of universal adult suffrage. Petrograd had led the Russian Revolution that brought down the monarchy in February 1917. After February, army official landowners and industrialists were influential in the provisional government, but the liberals as well as the socialists among them worked towards as elected government. Restrictions on public meetings and associations were removed. Soviets like Petrograd Soviet were set up everywhere through no common system of election was followed. In April 1917, the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia from this exile. He and Bolshevik had opposed the war since 1914, but he felt it was the time of Soviets to take over power. He declared that the war he brought to a close, land be transferred to the peasants and banks be nationalized. These three demands were Lenin's April thesis. He also argued that the Bolshevik party rename itself as the Communist Party to indicate its new radical aims. Most others in the Bolshevik party were initially surprised by the April thesis. They thought that the time was not yet ripe for a social revolution and the provisional government needed to be supported. But the developments of the subsequent months changed their attitude. Through the summer, the workers' movement spread. In industrial areas, factory committees were formed which began questioning the way industrialists ran the factories. Trade unions grew in number. Soldiers' committees were formed in the army. In June, about 500 Soviets sent representatives to all Russian Congress of Soviets. As the provisional government saw its power reduced and Bolshevik influence grew, decided to take stern measures against the spreading discontent. It resisted attempts by workers to run the factories and began arresting leaders. Popular demonstrations staged by the Bolshevik in July 1917 were sternly repressed. Many Bolshevik leaders had to go into the hiding or flee. Meanwhile, in the countryside, peasants and the social revolutionary leaders pressed for a distribution of land. Redistribution. Land committees were formed to handle this. Encouraged by the social revolutionaries, peasants seized land between July and September 1917. The Revolution of October 1917. As the conflict between the provisional government and the Bolshevik grew, Lenin feared the provisional government would set up a dictatorship. In September, he began discussions for the uprising against the government. Bolshevik supporters in the army, Soviet, and factories were brought together. Lenin feared the provisional government would set up a dictatorship. September, he began discussions for uprising against the government. Bolshevik supporters in the army, Soviet, and factories were brought together. On 16th October 1917, Lenin pursued at the Petrograd Soviet Bolshevik Party to agree to a socialist issue of power. A military revolutionary committee was appointed by the Soviet under Lenin Trotsky to organize this issue. The date of the event was kept a secret. Uprising began on 24th October, sensing trouble. Prime Minister Kerensky had left the city to summon troops. At dawn, military men loyal to the government seized the buildings of two Bolshevik newspapers. Pro-government troops were sent to take over telephone and telegram offices and protect the Winter Palace. In a swift response, the Military Revolutionary Committee ordered its supporters to seize government offices and arrest ministers. Late in the day, the ship Aurora shelled the Winter Palace. Other vessels sailed down the Neva, took over various military points. By nightfall, the city was under the committee control. Minister has surrendered. At a meeting of all Russian Congress of Soviets in Petrograd, the majority approved the Bolshevik action. Uprising took place in other cities. There has heavy fighting, especially in Moscow. But by December, the Bolshevik controlled the Moscow-Petrograd area. What changed after October? The Bolsheviks were totally opposed to private property. Most industry and banks were nationalized in November 1970. This meant that the government took over ownership and management. Land was declared social property and peasants were allowed to seize the land to the nobility. In cities, Bolsheviks enforced the partition of the large houses according to family requirements. They banned the use of the old titles of autocracy. To assert the change, new uniforms were designed for the army and officials, following a clothing competition organized in 1918 when the Soviet hat was chosen. The Bolshevik Party was renamed the Russian Communist Party. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks conducted the elections to the Constituent Assembly, but they failed to gain the majority support. In January 1918, the Assembly rejected Bolshevik measures and Lenin dismissed the Assembly. He thought that all Russian Congress of Soviets was more democratic than an assembly elected in uncertain conditions. In March 1918, despite oppositions by the political allies, the Bolsheviks had peace with Germany at Brest-Litovsk. In these years they followed, the Bolsheviks became the only party to participate in the elections to the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which became the parliament of the country. Russia became a one-party state. Trade unions were kept under the party control. The secret police called the Chefa first and the later OGPU and NKVD punished those who criticized the Bolsheviks. Many young writers and artists rallied to the party because it stood for socialism and for change. After October 1917, this led to experiments in the arts and architecture, but many became disillusioned because of the censorship of the party encouraged. Next is about the Civil War. When the Bolsheviks ordered land redistribution, the Russian army began to break up. Soldiers, mostly peasants, wished to go home for redistribution and deserted. Non-Bolshevik socialists, liberals, and supporters of autocracy condemned the Bolshevik uprising. The leaders moved to the South Asia, Russia, organized troops to fight the Bolsheviks, the Reds. During 1918-1919, the Greens, Social Revolutionaries, and White Pro-Tsarists controlled most of the Russian Empire. They were backed by French, American, British, and Japanese troops, all those forces who were worried at the growth of socialism in Russia. All these troops and the Bolsheviks fought a civil war, and that is looting, bandit tribe, and famine became common. Supporters of private property among the whites took harsh steps with peasants or seized land. Such actions had to lose loss of popular support for the non-Bolsheviks. By January 1920, the Bolshevik controlled the most of the former Russian Empire. They succeeded due to the cooperation with the non-Russian nationalists and Muslim jihadists. Cooperation did not work with the Russian socialist colonists themselves turned Bolshevik. In Cuba in Central Asia, Bolshevik colonists brutally massacred local nationalists in the name of defending socialism. In these situations, many were confused about the Bolshevik government represented. Party to remedy this, most Russian nationalities were given the political autonomy of the Soviet Union. The state the Bolshevik created the Russian Empire in December 1922. But since this was combined with unpopular policies that the Bolsheviks forced the local government to follow, like the harsh discouraged of nomadism, attempts to win over different nationalists were only successful. Then next it is about the making a socialist society. Making a socialist society. During the Civil War, the Bolsheviks kept industries and banks nationalized. They permitted peasants to cultivate the land that had been socialized. Bolsheviks used confiscated land to demonstrate what collective work could be. The process of centralized planning was introduced. Officials assessed how the economy could work and set targets for a 5-year period. On this basis, they made the 5-year plans. The government fixed or prices to promote industrial growth during the first two plans. 1927, 32, 1933, 1938. Centralized planning led to economic growth. Industrial production increased between 1929 and 33 by 100% in the case of oil, coal, and steel. New factory cities came into being. However, rapid construction led to poor working conditions. The city of Magnitogorsk, the construction of a steel plant was achieved in 3 years. Workers live hard lives, and the result was 550 stoppage of works in the first year alone. Living quarters in the winter time at 40 degrees below, people had to climb down from the fourth floor and dash across the street in order to go to the toilet. An extended schooling system developed and arrangements were made for factory workers and peasants to enter universities. Crunches were established in factories for the children of women workers. Cheap public health care was provided. Modern living quarters were set up for workers. Effect of all the wages was uneven, though since government resources were limited. Dreams and realities of Soviet childhood in 1933. Stalinism and collectivization. The period of the early planned economy was linked to the disasters of the colonizations of agriculture. By 1927-28, the towns in South Russia facing an acute problem of grain supplies. The government fixed prices at which grain must be sold, but the peasants refused to sell their grain to government buyers at their prices. Stalin, who headed the party after the death of the Lenin, introduced firm emergency measures. He believed that rich peasants and traders in the countryside were holding stocks in the hope of higher prices. Speculation had been stopped and supplies confiscated. 1928, party members toured the grain producing areas, supervising enforced grain collections and raiding kulaks, the name for well to do peasants. Shortages continued, the decisions were taken to collective farms. It was argued that grain shortages were partially due to the small size of holdings. After 1970, land had been given over to peasants. Small sized peasant farms could not be modernized. To develop modern farms and run them along industrial lines with machinery, it was necessary to eliminate kulaks, take away land from peasants, and establish state controlled large farms. What followed was Stalin's collectivization program. Party forced all peasants to cultivate in collective farms. The bulk of land and implements were transferred to the ownership of collective farms. Peasants worked on the land. The cargo profit was shared. Enraged peasants resisted and authorities and destroyed the livestock. Between 1929 and 31, the number of cattle fell by one-third. Those who resisted collectivization and severely punished them. Many were deported and exiled. As they resisted cultivation, peasants argued that they were not rich and they were not against socialism. They merely did not want to work in collective farms for a variety of reasons. Stalin's government allowed some independent cultivation but treated such cultivators unsympathetically. In spite of collectivization, production did not increase immediately. In fact, the bad habits of 1930-33 lead to one of the most devastating famines in South Soviet industry where over 4 million died. deported, forcibly removed from one's own country, exiled, forced to live away from one's own country. The global influence of the Russian Revolution and the USSR. Existing socialist party in Europe did not wholly approve to the way of the Bolsheviks took power and kept it. However, the possibility of the workers' state fired people's imagination across the world. Many countries' community parties were formed, like the Communist Party of Great Britain. The Bolshevik encouraged colonial peoples to follow their experiment. Many non-Russians are from outside USSR participated in the Conference of the People of the East 1920 and the Bolshevik formed a Comintern. Some received education in USS Communist University of the Workers in the East. By the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, the USSR had given socialism a global face and world stature. At the 1950s, it was acknowledged within the country that the style of the government in the USSR was not in keeping with the ideals of the Russian Revolution. In the world socialist movement, too, it was recognized that all over was not well in the Soviet Union, a backward country had become a great power. Its industries and agriculture had developed the power of being fed, but it had denied the essential freedoms to the citizens and carried out the development projects through repressive policies. By the end of the 20th century, international reputation of the USSR as a socialist country had diminished. Through it was recognized social ideas were still enjoyed respect among its people. In each country, the ideas of socialism were rethought in a variety of different ways. So that's all about this chapter. If you are interested, please do like, share, and subscribe my channel. Okay, thank you.